Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And if I can get the PowerPoint up. I do think that the burden of the speaker falls very heavily on those who are speaking after lunch, and perhaps particularly heavily on the person who comes before the coffee break. So, as well as speaking slowly, I will seek to speak well within my time limit and hopefully within 20 minutes. And I've also asked our very kind organisers to keep the lights up nice and bright for the PowerPoint so that none of us, including myself, are tempted to nod off. Just before I start, it would be remiss of me, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to not say what an honour, what a privilege it is to be here and to be part of such an unusual and exciting group of people. I've attended many, many trafficking meetings in the 15 years that I've been involved in this issue, but certainly none under the gentle and wise gaze of Pope Francis. And also I've had time to reflect while I've been here of the words of Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, when he consecrated this academy. My Latin is a little rusty, but with the help of Professor Morell, I was able to pick out some words that are extremely important, I think, for us today and tomorrow while we embark on this very ambitious and very important journey. Words like human dignity, solidarity, mutuality, and justice. What I'm going to say in hopefully as slowly and briefly as possible is to try and distill what is in essence 15 years of working in this area into a couple of key challenges and some recommendations that are focused most particularly at what the church community, the Vatican, can perhaps do to act as a circuit breaker, to actually move this issue forward. A lot of talk is happening, many laws have been passed, many conferences have been held, but I think we've already felt some evidence this morning of frustration at the lack of real and substantial progress, the lack of real impact. And we do definitely need to then examine the challenges around that. And I've identified just four: the challenge of impunity, the challenge of securing justice for victims of trafficking, the challenge of vulnerability, and of course something that's come up several times already today, the challenge of addressing demand for the goods and services that are produced through exploited labour. And I've taken the liberty at the end of my presentation to just make a few brief recommendations along the lines that I mentioned previously. Sorry, I'll get this PowerPoint working. Okay. Okay, the challenge of impunity, and this is something that's very important for me. I started my work in trafficking as a human rights lawyer, and I've stayed very much attached to the centrality of human rights as the core of any effective trafficking response. But I've been especially fortunate in having spent the last 10 years working in my day job on the front line, working with prosecutors and judges and police officials and lawmakers in trying to develop an effective criminal justice response to trafficking. And the first recognition we need to make there is that trafficking is a crime. It's not good enough, at least I don't think, to treat this issue as some kind of social welfare problem or as something less than what it is, something less than murder or rape or armed robbery or the kinds of crimes that we actually do take very, very seriously. Now, it's one thing to say that and quite another to try and work out what a good criminal justice response to trafficking actually looks like. And the challenges in ending impunity, we should never never underestimate them because they're extremely significant. A lot of trafficking takes place, as we know, across borders, and I don't think I'm saying anything new to point out that governments are not very good at working across borders. They haven't got the systems or the mechanisms in place to actually cooperate to this level. And traffickers take advantage of the safe havens that are created by that reality. And we should also never forget that this is a crime that's extremely difficult to investigate and effectively prosecute. The law enforcement officials amongst us, I know very well, we all dream of a day when we have proactive, intelligence-led policing that will allow us to prosecute exploiters without involving the victims, but that day is very far away. And it's true in every single country that I've worked in that you don't get a prosecution for trafficking without having the victim in the courtroom testifying. And victims have no incentive whatsoever to be involved in the prosecution of their exploiters, and that is wrong. So I feel very strongly that an effective criminal justice response to trafficking is an essential part of any effective response. It's not something to put to the side. It's not something to denigrate or to dismiss as perhaps a luxury. It's not like that at all. I've spent the last 10 years working with criminal justice practitioners in trying to figure out what an effective criminal justice response to trafficking might actually look like. I'm not going to go through this diagram. There's much more detail in the paper that I submitted. But I think the point to make with this slide is that there are many pieces of the puzzle, and without one of those pieces, everything falls apart. If we don't identify victims of trafficking, for example, we have no cases. If we don't have specialist law enforcement officials, people who are trained to investigate this very complex crime, we don't get any prosecutions. So one builds on the other, and all of these elements are absolutely essential. The challenge of securing justice for victims of trafficking. For me, this is the other side of an effective criminal justice response. An effective criminal justice response is not just about ending impunity of exploiters, it's also about using the system to give victims the justice that they actually deserve. This is the other side, and you can't have one without the other. I think my experience working with countries has made that very clear to me, that a country that tries to pursue just one side of this equation, its attempts are doomed to irrelevance and to failure. So in terms of the challenges that face us with victims, they are many and they're very difficult. Perhaps the very first one is identification. We know the numbers I think the numbers will always be soft. We can argue about them forever, like we can argue about the difference between slavery and trafficking and forced labour. But we know very well that only a small percentage of the number of people who are exploited for private profit very severely are ever identified. And the fact that they're identified means that not identified means that they will never secure the rights to which all of these beautiful laws that I've been involved in developing actually give them. So identification is first and foremost one of the most important things, and one of the areas where we are consistently, in every single country, falling down. Now, victims who are identified have a right to immediate protection and support. And with every right comes an obligation. And what that means is that governments have an obligation to identify victims and then to provide them with immediate protection and support, and to make sure that that support is not tied to victims' cooperation with the criminal justice system. So we see in a number of countries, for example, that the government will say, okay, we will give you some protection and support, but only if you are a witness, and otherwise you're going to be deported. That's wrong. I'm very happy that the United States government has come out so strongly against this practice, and I think we are turning the tide of detaching victim support from their cooperation in the criminal justice system. Governments need to be able to persuade victims to cooperate. They cannot force them in this way. They need to have strong criminal justice systems that make victims feel safe and make them feel like the criminal justice system is going to deliver something for them. The Special Rapporteur, who's right next to me, has done some wonderful work on the issue of remedies. That victims of trafficking are victims of crime and victims of human rights violations. And all of the countries of the world have acknowledged explicitly in law that these categories of victims have a right of access to remedies. And this doesn't happen almost anywhere, and that is a wrong. And I won't speak too much, I've got quite a bit in my paper on the special challenges that are around children. Children are identified separately in international law. There's a separate definition of child trafficking compared to adult trafficking, and there's a very good reason for that, because children have particular vulnerabilities and they have particular needs which must be addressed separately and in a special way. I'm getting the hang of this. The challenge of vulnerability. This has come up frequently, I think, through all of the presentations today. So I won't spend too much time on this. But we have to address why certain groups and certain individuals are more vulnerable to exploitation than you and than I. A lot of ink has been spilt on this issue, and I don't think we have it completely right, but we do start to understand very well the link between violations of very fundamental human rights and vulnerability to trafficking. And I've just identified a couple up there, and once again, there's much more detail in my background paper. There's been a lot of talk about poverty. I feel quite strongly that we also need to talk about inequality within and between countries. This is what drives movement. This is what drives people to take the kind of dangerous migration decisions that you and I would never, ever, ever dream of taking. So we have to look at inequality as well as absolute poverty. It goes without question that the issue of discrimination against migrants needs to be openly addressed. I'm a lawyer. That's what I do, and that's the area that I feel most comfortable in. And I understand the international protections around migrants and how deficient they are. And I believe very strongly that there is a system that could only really be described as global apartheid between migrants and citizens, because the rights to which migrants are entitled under international law are very, very, very few, and that's not good enough. And I echo the call that Ambassador Swing made in his presentation earlier today about really getting to the fundamentals of this kind of exploitation, which is so often, so frequently about this basic and structural discrimination against migrants that every one of our countries operates under every single day. Discrimination and violence against women, I think that that's self-evident. Once again, much more detail in my paper. But I'm talking about discrimination in law as well as discriminatory attitudes and behaviours that make women particularly vulnerable to the kinds of exploitation we see described as human trafficking. And once again, recognising the special and particular vulnerabilities of children and the need for quite a different approach. Finally, the challenge of demand. Another topic that's been brought up by many, many speakers today. I feel it's important for us to distinguish between two kinds of demand if we're going to actually analyse carefully what needs to be done to actually deal with this. We're talking about employer demand for cheap, exploitable and controllable labour, and we're talking about consumer demand for the cheap services, cheap goods and cheap sex that is produced by trafficked people and by people who've been exploited. Quite often, the issue of demand, it falls into a discussion of the clients of sex workers and such things, and of course, that's very important. But I do feel that it would be remiss of me and perhaps not very courageous if I failed to speak quite frankly about what I believe to be the contribution of states to both creating and perpetuating demand around trafficking. This is not something that's spoken of very often, but I feel that it's very important. States can, of course, sustain demand around trafficking through their laws and processes that allow, for example, victims to be, migrants to be particularly vulnerable to the kind of exploitation we see with trafficking. But we also have to face the harsh and unpleasant truth that states have conflicting agendas when it comes to human trafficking. Many countries, including many of the countries that I've worked in, benefit enormously from a large irregular population of migrants who can be moved on very quickly and very easily if the economic situation changes. They like having a population of irregular migrant workers in their country. And they do not give those migrant workers any protection, even though those migrant workers are directly contributing, often very substantially, to the economy of those countries. I think many states turn a blind eye. They may pontificate about the sex industry, but they turn a blind eye to a sex industry that's comprised primarily or even exclusively of exploited foreigners. This is not just one or two countries I'm speaking of now, but many countries. And I think even countries of origin that are sending their workers overseas and that rely very heavily on remittances from their workers, they have a vested interest in maintaining relationships, and perhaps they have a tolerance for a certain percentage of their migrant workers being exploited. So these are the very difficult truths that we may need to acknowledge if we're going to get past what seems to me quite a sterile debate on the issue of demand. And I've flagged up there the question of demand and discrimination. I've put that into my paper, but these, once again, interlinked problems that really need to be dealt with together. It's very difficult to choose a menu of recommendations. I think that it's a difficult job to try and isolate those things that actually need to be focused on, because we all run the risk of drowning in a sea of the impossible. The challenge seems to be so huge, and the forces marshalled against us seem to be so many. But I think that we can take heart. And perhaps for those of us who have been working on trafficking for a longer time, we seem to have more optimism, because I remember a day when this kind of discussion, this sort of meeting would never, ever, ever have taken place. And that day was really, it was only a decade ago. So much progress has been made, at least in understanding and moving the conversation forward. It's just important we don't stop here. My recommendations, which are fleshed out in my background paper, start first and foremost with something that the Special Rapporteur has been very clear about: the need to prioritise human rights and human dignity in everything we do, to put the victim at the centre of our responses to human trafficking. And that's a very good way of making sure that perhaps other conflicting agendas are kept in their place, because they'll always be there. I believe that we should demand an effective criminal justice response to human trafficking. That is within the capacity of every single government. And it's not being delivered now, and we need to ask why. We have the expertise, we have the knowledge, and it's not happening as quickly or as well as it should. We need to make very strong efforts to reduce vulnerabilities, particularly through worker and migrant protection. This conversation is still very difficult to have with many, many countries, but it's something that really must begin very soon. We have to address demand, including the involvement of states in both generating and sustaining demand for the goods and services produced through trafficking. And I should add at the end that we need to accept the primary responsibility of destination countries. I do not excuse for a moment the involvement of countries of origin or their responsibility for addressing the corruption and the mismanagement and the lack of a rule of law and the lack of justice that generates these terrible flows. But at the end of the day, we have to accept that it is the economies of the wealthy countries that are benefiting disproportionately from the exploitation of human beings. And for this reason, it is these countries that must take the leadership role. That's a fairly controversial position in some quarters, but I feel very strongly about it. We're the winners in this trafficking game, so we really need to stand up and take the lead. Now finally, just a couple of thoughts, a few very brief thoughts about a role for the Catholic Church. Once again, feeling the good spirit coming from both sides of this beautiful, beautiful room. I do believe very strongly that it's time now for true moral and spiritual leadership on this issue. I've been working now with governments, as I said, for 15 years. I've been working with the international community, with very many parts of the United Nations. They all have a role to play, but we need this leadership, and we need it urgently. We need it to create that circuit breaker, and we need the leadership to come through to the international community, to states, to the church community, and to the broader civil society. And I believe very strongly that the Catholic Church and our wonderful, wonderful Pope can be exactly that kind of force that we need. And in terms of much more direct action, we need to work on the rights of migrants. We can avoid that for as long as we like, but at the end of the day, nothing much is going to happen until we address this global apartheid against non-citizens. I feel that the idea of a global minimum wage, I used to think it was the stuff of dreams, but I also thought an international criminal court was the stuff of dreams. So why don't we think a little bit more creatively and a little bit higher towards something like that? An end to recruitment fees and global minimum wage. With these two actions, I think we could end at least 60 or 70% of the exploitation we see today. Mr. Chairman, I just finish with two quotes that are very close to my heart because they guide my work and give me inspiration even when I sometimes feel that things are going a little bit too slowly. That wonderful one from Proverbs, open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And the second one from William Wilberforce, who stood up with a kind of courage that I can't even imagine in front of the UK Parliament in 1791, and he said to all of these people who are attacking him, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know. Thank you.